Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the fifth in a series of programs I'm doing on loneliness and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. We know that loneliness is part of the human experience, that virtually all people experience loneliness at times. So far in this series, I've focused on some of the major causes of loneliness. Today, I wish to change the focus to some ways in which we might deal with our loneliness. In other words, how have the great thinkers suggested we deal with our feelings of loneliness? But first, I want to comment on one more possible cause of loneliness, and that is excessive conformity. Yes, conformity. How can too much conformity lead to loneliness? Well, so many of the great thinkers say it can lead to a loneliness for one's authentic self, for one's true self. Humanitarian Albert Schweitzer put it this way: we are all so much together, but we are all dying of loneliness. David Reisman wrote a very famous book with the revealing title, The Lonely Crowd. One of the best-known books about this theme was written in the 1950s. It's entitled The Organization Man by William H. White. White popularized such terms as organization man, yes man, and togetherness. In the 1950s, this rather famous author examined the values of junior and senior executives, at least many of them, at some major corporations. And he also examined the values of the people living in the suburbs where these executives were raising their children. White concluded that conformity, excessive conformity in his view, was an important value to these people. He claimed this was not good for them or for society. Conformity, of course, is an issue we all have to deal with. Each of us has to decide for himself or herself how much we're going to conform. There is an important question, though, that each of us has to answer, and that is, does too much conformity lead to a kind of spiritual death? Does too much conformity lead to less self-respect? So many of the famous thinkers claim that in order to live a fulfilling life, we must cultivate our individuality. We must cultivate our uniqueness. Jesus and Buddha, for example, were not conformists. Do you think Jesus and Buddha would have been good organization men? Do you think Jesus and Buddha would have been yes men? Can you see them as CEOs of major corporations? Can you imagine Jesus and Buddha in $3,000 Armani suits getting into a chauffeur-driven limo? Important question. Do you think the lives of Buddha and Jesus and of those people who try to use Jesus and Buddha as models on which to base their lives, do you think these people live more satisfying lives or less satisfying lives than those who are quintessential conformists, quintessential organization men and women, and yes men and women? The psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, in the 1950s, wrote a couple of books in which he talked about the dangers of conformity. Fromm claimed that too much conformity can lead to self-alienation. Let me give you a brief passage from one of Erich Fromm's books. He said this: modern man is alienated from himself and from his fellow man. Human relations are essentially those of alienated automatons who base their security on staying close to the herd and not being different in thought, feeling, or action. Psychoanalyst Fromm went on to say this, and I'm quoting him: while everybody tries to be as close as possible to the rest, everybody remains utterly alone. He claimed conformity doesn't help us to overcome our loneliness and separateness. He claimed that too much conformity can lead to an anxiety for one's true self. What do you think? Can one be lonely for one's authentic self? Psychiatrist Carl Jung thought so. He talked about the process of individuation. He said it was essential for achieving optimum mental health. Joseph Campbell, a professor who was a disciple of Jung, called on all of us to undertake an intellectual journey to discover who we really are. Here are Campbell's own words: the call is to leave a certain social situation, move into your own loneliness, and find the jewel, the center that is impossible to find when you are socially engaged. You are to cross the threshold into new life. It's a dangerous adventure because one is now leaving the conformity of the crowd. Campbell, like Jung, stressed the idea that loneliness, if used properly, can be a creative experience. That loneliness, if used properly, can lead to good things. I mentioned before the psychiatrist Carl Jung, who talked about the process of individuation, the process of trying to become more individuated, the process of trying to cultivate one's uniqueness. Jung believed that individuation means parting from the crowd, and that at first, that accentuates loneliness. In other words, the idea is that at first, when one conforms less, one will feel more lonely. But Jung contended that eventually conforming less will lead to less loneliness. How so? Why so? Well, Jung contended that as we become less phony and more authentic, this leads to a more satisfying feeling about ourselves. It leads to more self-respect and less loneliness for one's authentic self. Also, when one conforms less, according to Jung, in distancing ourselves from the crowd, we begin to see the crowd and ourselves more clearly. This results, according to Jung, in more empathy, in more compassion, in more solidarity. It is interesting that both Jesus and Buddha not only were nonconformists, but each spent much time alone. A famous rabbi, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, I think provides some illumination here. He said this, and I'm quoting Rabbi Heschel: genuine solitude is a search for genuine solidarity. He also said, there is no dignity without the ability to stand alone. And also, one must withdraw and be still in order to hear. It is interesting that Buddhist monks, Christian monks, essentially have been people who left society because they wished to live more fulfilling lives. Well, one might get the idea that monks therefore become very divorced from the rest of us. Well, not so have commented many monks and many people who have known monks. Indeed, it has been said that a monk is someone who is separate from all, but who is in harmony with all. The idea being that in conforming less, in leaving the crowd, so to speak, the monk eventually achieves a higher level of consciousness where he feels even closer to people, spiritually closer to people. The German philosopher Nietzsche put it this way: loneliness can be the escape of the sick, but loneliness can also be the escape from the sick. An important way to reduce loneliness, according to so many thinkers, is to conform less. And one of the best reasons to conform less is that the conformists in history, so often the majority in history, have done so much evil. For example, conformists contributed over the centuries to unfair treatment of women, of blacks, of ethnic minorities, of Jews, of gays, of religious minorities. Writer Ernest Becker put it this way: all through history, it has been the normal man, the average man, who has laid waste to the world. Allow me some examples of some of the attempts at ultimate conformity that have been so dangerous to people throughout history. Nazism is a very good example, I think. A good Nazi was an ultra-conformist. Communism also, I think, is an example of this. We have all heard about the party line in communism, that good communists, were to espouse the party line. A good communist was an ultra-conformist. A good communist suppressed dissent, and in doing so did much damage to society and to many individuals. Christianity, unfortunately, at times, has also been dangerous for people. That Christianity for several centuries, Christianity for several centuries had its own party line. And this party line involved, for example, the Inquisition, which involved the burning alive of religious heretics, whereby the Catholic Church condoned burning people alive because they disagreed with some fundamental Catholic beliefs. The Catholic Church also, as part of its party line over many centuries, had a list of forbidden books. Some of the great writers, such as Montaigne, had their books put on this list of forbidden books, and therefore many people were deprived of reading great books. At least some of these books were great books with terrific insights about human nature and people. And of course, part of the party line in Christianity for several centuries involved promoting religious wars so as to promote religious conformity. And also, the Catholic Church for centuries was anti-scientific. The Galileo episode perhaps being the outstanding example. And also, unfortunately, for several centuries, Christian conformists promoted anti-Semitism. Arguably, it was the non-conformists among the Christians who saved Christianity, the Catholic Church in particular. It was the non-conformists among the Christians who eventually argued for tolerance and separation of church and state. Some would say today, radical Islam has fallen into the same path the Christians at one time fell into. That it seems that radical Islam has its own agenda, its own party line, so to speak, and that it also promotes conformity. And conformity to what? Conformity to terrorism. And so often, conformity to promoting the idea that women should be subservient to men. Again, this is a reminder of what Nietzsche said. You recall, Nietzsche said, loneliness can be the escape of the sick, but loneliness can also be the escape from the sick. Theologian Paul Tillich, very famous theologian, Paul Tillich, talked about the importance of nonconformists. At a university graduation many years ago, in his commencement address, he said this, and again, I'm quoting Paul Tillich. We hope for nonconformists among you, for your sake, for the sake of our nation, and for the sake of humanity. And also, in the 1950s, the president of Yale University, Whitney Griswold, spoke of, and I'm quoting him now, spoke of a nightmare picture of a whole nation of yes men. A nightmare picture of a whole nation of yes men. I've been talking about the possible connection between loneliness and conformity, and the idea that too much conformity can actually increase our loneliness, and that reducing our conformity can actually reduce our loneliness. In other words, I'm suggesting that one way we might all try to reduce our loneliness in life is by conforming less. And I know this is not always easy. It's usually not easy, the idea of conforming less. But again, most of the good things in life don't come easily to us. Important question. How else might we deal with our feelings of loneliness? Well, the great thinkers are unanimous in saying that we must accept a certain amount of loneliness in our lives, that a certain degree of loneliness in life is inevitable. The idea is perhaps none of us can ever completely eliminate loneliness from one's life. Also, the great thinkers claim we should give up as illusion the idea that one's wife or husband or children or friends can completely eliminate loneliness from our lives. Also, the great thinkers claim we should use loneliness as a learning experience. Loneliness can be an opportunity for self-knowledge. Hermann Hesse, Nobel Prize-winning writer, put it this way: loneliness is the way by which destiny endeavors to lead man to himself. Again, loneliness is the way by which destiny endeavors to lead man to himself. And sociologist Clark Moustakis, in a book I highly recommend, a book called Lonliness, a book entitled Lonliness, which you will find in the sociology section of your local library, Moustakis has said this: loneliness brings into awareness new dimensions of the self, new beauty, new power for human compassion, and a reverence for the precious nature of each breathing moment. The idea is that loneliness can lead to greater introspection, and greater introspection can lead to a higher level of awareness, a higher level of consciousness. So many of the great thinkers have commented that most of our personal mental and spiritual growth takes place in solitude, that in solitude we can learn to grow in empathy and compassion. In our loneliness, we can perceive the vulnerability of all people. Again, in our loneliness, we can perceive the vulnerability of all people. In our loneliness, we are reminded that we are all going to die. In our loneliness, we can be reminded that we are all vulnerable to sickness and accident. And in our loneliness, we can be reminded that all of our most intimate relationships, all of our most intimate relationships cause us anxiety as well as satisfaction. In so many ways, we human beings are all in the same boat. Hamlet put it well. Shakespeare's Hamlet talked about, and I'm quoting him, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. And we should not be fooled by the smiling faces around us. A famous Buddhist monk, talking about the smiling faces we may encounter each day, put it this way: deep inside, every one of us is carrying a very heavy load. As human beings, it is natural that we feel anger and frustration and even hatred. We are trying to suppress them. What can loneliness, used properly, do for us? Clark Moustakis, the sociologist I alluded to before, in his book, again entitled Lonliness, says this: loneliness paves the way to healing, to true compassion, to intimate bonds with all living creatures. Is there anything else we can do to reduce our loneliness besides the things I've already mentioned? Well, yes. We can learn to enjoy our own company. This is indispensable to living a fulfilling life. If we can enjoy our own company, we can double our pleasure in living. In that, we can still enjoy other people's company, but also enjoy solitude, enjoy being alone. Also, if we wish to diminish our loneliness, we should reach out to others. We can do this in numerous ways: with a smile, an act of kindness, service to others. It is interesting that self-absorption increases our loneliness, whereas concern for others reduces our loneliness. We can get involved in a cause. We can get involved in something bigger than ourselves. In a very famous book by Jean-Paul Sartre, very famous French philosopher, in his book called Nausea, he talks about a man who's been suffering from extreme loneliness. The character is referred to as the self-taught man. But this man who's been suffering from great loneliness finds a way to eliminate much of the loneliness in his life. And I'm going to quote a short passage from Sartre's book in which this Frenchman talks about what he's done to reduce his loneliness. I must preface my reading of this by telling you he's made a decision to join the French Socialist Party. And by the way, the fact that the party is socialist, I think, is irrelevant here. Could have been the Republican Party, Democrat. In any event, the character says this: before taking this decision to join the Socialist Party, I felt myself in a loneliness so frightful that I contemplated suicide. But I am no longer lonely, monsieur. But naturally, monsieur, it is not necessary. I am no longer lonely, monsieur. I mean, I no longer feel lonely. I no longer feel alone. But naturally, monsieur, it is not necessary for me to be with anyone. Again, the idea is that this very lonely people, in joining a party he believed in joining an organization he believed would make the world better, felt that by being of service to mankind, he was reducing his loneliness. Again, the idea is that when we render service to other people, that can do a lot to decrease our loneliness. I see I'm running short on time. I will continue this next week or the following week. Right now, again, as usual, I'd like to conclude with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. He penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."